Amanda Todd was just 15 years old when she hung herself. Amanda met a man online who took inappropriate screenshots of Amanda and proceeded to follow her around the internet and harass her for years. He found her classmates on Facebook, and he would send them the picture he took of her. To cope with the anxiety, Amanda turned to drugs and alcohol, but it came too much for her. Mr. Zuckerberg, clearly, Ms. Todd was underage, so the photo that was shared to harass her was illegal. Do you believe that Facebook bears any responsibility for the role it played in her death, yes or no?
Sorry, I was muted. Congressman, it's an incredibly sad story, and I think that we certainly have a responsibility to make sure that we're building systems that can fight and remove this kind of harmful content. And in the case of child exploitation content, we've been building systems for a long time that use AI, and we have thousands of people working on being able to identify this content and remove it. And I think our systems are generally pretty effective at this. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we keep improving them.
My time's pretty short, but would you say yes or no then?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, in the question, yes or no, then any responsibility?
Congressman, I believe that the responsibility of the platform.
Well, let me move on because I've got very short on time. Do you believe that Facebook should be held accountable for any role in her death? Yes or no?
Congressman, the responsibility that I think platforms should have is to build effective systems to moderate this content.
I'm going to have to take that, just you're not responding to the question. Unfortunately, stories like Amanda Todd's are only becoming more common. While we often talk about how your platforms can be used for good or evil, the evil seems to persevere. Mr. Zuckerberg, you've publicly stated that you support thoughtful changes to Section 230 to ensure that tech companies are held accountable for certain actions that happen on their platforms, such as child exploitation. What specific changes do you support in Section 230?
Thanks, Congressman. I would support two specific changes, especially for large platforms. Although I want to call out that I think for smaller platforms, I think we need to be careful about any changes that we make that remove their immunity, because that could hurt competition. So let me just call on these for larger platforms. I think first, platforms should have to issue transparency reports that state the prevalence of content across all different categories of harmful content, everything from child exploitation to terrorism to incitement of violence to intellectual property violations to pornography, whatever the different harms are. And
well, let me ask you quick now, where those transparency reports be reported to, and how often do you think those should be going out?
Well, Congressman, as a model, Facebook has been doing something to this effect for every quarter, right, where we report on the prevalence of each category of harmful content and how effective our systems are at identifying that content and removing it in advance. And I think the company should be held accountable for having effective systems to do that broadly. The second change that I would propose is creating accountability for the large platforms to have effective systems in place to moderate and remove clearly illegal content. So things like sex trafficking or child exploitation or terrorist content. And I think it would be reasonable to condition immunity for the larger platforms on having a generally effective system in place to moderate clearly illegal types of content.
Let me interrupt real quick because I'm running really short on time, because I know in your testimony you're talking about that you say that platforms should not be held liable if a particular piece of content evades its detection. So again, that's one of the areas when you're talking about the transparency and also the accountability I'd like to follow up on. I have to go on real quick. Mr. Pichai, yes or no, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg's changes to Section 230?
There are definitely good proposals around transparency and accountability, which I've seen in various legislative proposals as well. which I think are important principles, and we would certainly welcome legislative approaches in that area.
Okay, Mr. Dorsey, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no? On the changes on 230?
I think the ideas around transparency are good. I think it's going to be very hard to determine what's a large platform and a small platform, and it may incentivize the wrong things.
Okay, gentlemen.